Kenya has just gone through what is arguably the most monetized and commercialized general elections in the region. On ground, over 150 helicopters were observed being used by candidates at presidential, senatorial, and gubernatorial level. High-end SUVs were also observed being used by majority of the candidates. On one rally, the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya presidential candidate arrived at a rally with a convoy of 7 helicopters, of which 4 were privately owned. It was established that renting a chopper or helicopter was going for $2,000 per hour. There are suspicions that most of the money that was flowing in the election campaigns was coming from dirty sources, including syndicated corruption and money laundering. Kenya in 2013 developed a progressive election campaign financing law, but this law has twice been rendered futile by the same parliament that passed it. It is clear that none of the political elite in Kenya would wish to have this law enforced on them, hence the conspiracy to fight it. In the judgment made by court in May 2022, whereas court found that Parliament does not have powers to approve or disapprove the spending limits, it refused to quash the decision of the National Assembly to annul the enforcement of campaign financing regulations developed and published by the IEBC in 2021. It is against this backdrop that the Alliance for Finance Monitoring (ACFIM), in partnership with African Election Observers Network (AFIONET), have organized this webinar to interrogate the scale and magnitude of monetization of elections in Kenya and the lessons African electoral jurisdictions can draw from this.
Welcome to the 9th Money in Politics webinar series. My name is Abel Eseru. This webinar is brought to you by Alliance for Finance Monitoring, which is a political finance watchdog renowned for monitoring election campaign financing and knowledge generation on the subject of political finance in Africa. ACFIM has partnered with the African Election Observers Network, that's AFIONET, which is a renowned coordinating platform for African election observation blocks, namely East and Horn of African Election Observation Network, then the West African Election Observers Network, WAON, and then also the Southern African Development Community Election Support Network. We are live streaming this webinar on all our social media platforms, that is, and also YouTube channel of ACFIM and AFIONET. Kindly make sure you like and follow ACFIM and AFIONET on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube channel. Today we have a panel of 5 experts that will join me to unpack the theme on monetized Kenya elections 2022, what lessons for Africa. But before I proceed to introduce the guest panelists, allow me on behalf of ACFIM and AFIONET to send an apology to all those watching from wherever you are for us not having a female panelist today. It was not our deliberate effort that we don't have one, but we had initially confirmed 2 female guest panelists, but due to unforeseen engagements, they sent in their regrets and they couldn't be able to participate, but they did also nominate some of the male guests here today to step in on their behalf. So allow me introduce the guests who are with me today. I will start with Mr. Derek Frederick Makandi from Kenya. He is a lawyer by training, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He has over 9 years work experience in legal aid, legislative and policy reforms, electoral governance, human rights and research. He is currently working with Transparency International Kenya as the Programs Officer, Policy, Legal and Institutional Frameworks. Derek has also previously worked with Mzalendo Trust, Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. Derek, you are welcome to this webinar. The next person who is also with us today is Mr. Henry Muguzi from Uganda. Henry is a seasoned campaign finance expert with over 12 years of experience in analyzing the legal and institutional frameworks for campaign financing in several electoral jurisdictions. He has observed elections in multiple countries, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Lebanon, and South Africa. He has authored several reports. Some include Unregulated Campaign Spending and Its Impact on Electoral Participants in Uganda, and also Commercialized Politics and Captivity of State Institutions in Uganda. Henry is the founding executive director of Alliance for Finance Monitoring and also a founding member of the African Election Observers Network, AFIONET. Henry, you're welcome to this webinar series.
Thank you, Abel.
And we are also joined by Mr. You're welcome. We are also joined by Mr. Chimuka Nachimbinga from Zambia. He is the Democratic Governance Program Lead at Transparency International Zambia. He possesses over 7 years of experience in governance research, budget analysis, socio-economic advocacy, social accountability, social protection, debt analysis, public policy analysis, among others. He has acquired various trainings in the areas of monitoring political corruption, abuse of state resources in elections, illicit financial flows, and domestic resource mobilizations in the era of digital economies in Africa. Mr. Chimuka, you are also welcome to this webinar series. And then we shall also be joined by Mr. Edgar Tabaro, who is from Uganda. He is a lawyer and governance expert. He is currently a senior partner at KTA Advocates in Kampala and also a special envoy for Sudan's oldest political party, UMMA party. He is an emeritus senior lecturer and law school law school dean of Uganda Christian University. He writes and speaks on politics in the Great Lakes region. Mr. Edgar Tabaro, you're once again welcome to the webinar series. Though it's your first time being here, we have hosted you several times on some of our virtual talk shows, but it's your first time being hosted on the Money in Politics webinar series. You're welcome, Mr. Edgar. And then lastly, we are going to have Dr. Kazibwe Samuel from also Uganda. Dr. Samuel Kazibwe is an award-winning broadcast journalist, academic, and researcher. He holds a PhD in Cultural and Media Studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He also holds a master's degree in human rights from Makerere University and a bachelor's degree in mass communication. As a journalist in the last 15 years, Dr. Kazibwe has worked as a reporter, news anchor, talk show producer, stroke host, and news editor for several local media outlets. He is currently the manager for research, innovations, and development at CBS FM in Uganda. Besides journalism, Dr. Kazibwe is also a senior lecturer at Uganda Christian University in the School of Journalism, Media, and Communication. His interests are in research that fall under mass communication theory, media law, development communication, governance, and human rights. So these are the 5 guests who are going to be discussing with us today the theme on monetized Kenya, monetized 22, and what lessons for Africa. I want now to bring Mr. Chimuka. We've just heard from Derek, and also I want it's true, I also read a report from the South African Revenue Service, which revealed that there were over 325 helicopters that were imported on leased to Kenya in 2022. And most of those things I know ended up in what you say, it was more of now the air show, not again the road show. So I want to know from Mr. Chimuka. I know there's no difference between campaigns in Kenya and Zambia in terms of choppers and what. Can you bring us up to speed on what also happens outside of Zambia in comparison to what happens in Kenya? And what magnitude is it that side of Zambia? Mr. Chimuka, are you on?
Thank you, yes, I am on. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, you can proceed.
Are you able to hear? Yes, thank you so much. First of all, let me just give a history of campaign financing law or legislation in Zambia. So basically, Zambia has never legally provided for uh, sourcing for political parties uh, for a long period of time. Of course, some strides were made in 2003 to try and legislate political party and campaign financing in Zambia. But of course, this did not see the light at the end of the day for reasons that, of course, the country was not in a position to be able to fund political parties. So, as we speak right now, we do not have a piece of legislation when it comes to political campaign financing. What this implies is that political parties are free to get resources from different sources. This would include membership fees internally, but these monies or these resources, of course, are not enough because they rely on membership fees and some of the assets that they have, and also the wealthness of a leader that leads that particular party. So you find that these resources may not be enough for them to run an election. So what do they do? They look for sources outside the country. And basically, these sources outside the country, some of them are questionable sources or they are dirty sources, of course, that these different political parties do source for resources. So what happens now, give you the scenario 2021 general election, is that, of course, this is one of the elections for us where we saw a lot of being used. As transparency, we did more assessment on just the cost of billboards that these political parties were using, and we used proxy indicators. So you find that within a period of May and June, just for Lusaka only, the Patriotic Front, for example, spent about 6 billion on billboards. The Patriotic Front was able to book for all the spaces in different radio stations for them to be able to or different adverts where if you answer a question, you are given a sum of money that you can be able to use. Different cadres, political cadres, especially from the ruling part by then, Patriotic Front, were sleeping on monies that are sprayed with, were sleeping on beds sprayed with money. So this, to us, was one of the most expensive election that we have ever witnessed in Zambia. And in terms of where this money is coming from, since we do not have a piece of legislation, like I mentioned, comes from different sources. It could be in and it could be outside the country. For example, towards the last year, there were some members of the Patriotic Front who were ministers in 2016. And according to the Constitution, when we are in the current period, ministers have to relinquish their roles, and we do not have ministers. But by then, the ministers refused to relinquish their role, but they were taken to court and sued. And what happened is that before the 2021 general elections, the Patriotic Front paid all the dues that their ministers owed in 2016. And we do not know where that money came from as we speak right now. So what I'm trying to do is that because of a lack of this piece of legislation, there has been no integrity, no transparency and accountability in terms of where political parties do get finances to manage elections. And as a result, to some extent, we have seen that our country has been auctioned to a certain extent, in that, for during the period of the Patriotic Front, we could see, for example, road construction was given always to one contractor, okay? And this contractor, to some extent, had pumped a lot of money to fund the Patriotic Front government by then. And this, to some extent, of course, brings in the issue of state capture, it brings in the issue of police capture, and so forth and so on. And since these private sector businesses pump in a lot, how this money is to ensure they influence whatever policy, they influence whatever decisions that the government is making when it comes to sharing of the national resources. So you discover that the government will always have a sector. Okay, for example, here in Zambia, we have got a sector called infrastructure development. The government will always have a sector where they could pump a lot of resources. And why are they pumping a lot of resources? Because this is where these people that pumped a lot of resources in that particular political party will recoup their money. And this money is not just the principal amount of money that they spent, it will have to come with the interest. I'll give you an example. For example, when you look at the 2020 Auditors General report here in Zambia, we lost about 1.4 billion Zambian kwacha to a contract that was given to a cartel of people, but just because government failed to pay a part, government failed to pay these people money as agreed, like first installment. The contract started any interest to a tune of 1.4 billion. This money was for a company to build a food reserve agents shelters. So these shelters were not built, but the company went away with a whooping 1.4 billion kwacha. Okay, already that there is a calculated move in terms of political corruption, and this political corruption is coming as a result of allowing private political parties to free resource from dirty hands. So as we speak right now, to some extent, here in Zambia, we have allowed political parties to source monies from dirty hands. And when this particular political party comes into power, those people that funded that particular political party will have to recoup the money whatsoever way. And this is the situation as we speak right now, because we do not have this piece of legislation which could regulate the amount of which could regulate where political parties could get the funds, give us the accountability, and also probably give put a cap in terms of how much money a political party to. Maybe just before I would also mention on the issue of how this big money has actually affected the electorates. Of course, here in Zambia, it's in plain and white that electorates down there could be urban dwellers or rural dwellers. We will just wait for a bigger pocket. That is a person that they are going to give attention to. A person who doesn't have resources, of course, becomes very difficult for them to be able to win elections here in Zambia. So it means that the mindset of electorates has completely changed from looking at the qualities of a person to looking at how much money can this person give us. Okay, and to some extent, vote buying has actually influenced people's decision. And we saw it in 2021, where the then ruling Patriotic Front government, even before the general election, when we had by elections, they could create a non-existing emergency situation where there's a by election. For example, if it is in the northern part, then they could create an emergency so that they could save in terms of social cash transfers, in terms of staffs, fictitious kind of development, for example, doing improving the health sector, so that people can just be moved in one way or the other. So basically, as we speak right now, of course, it's on a sad part that due to this corrupt kind of life that we have allowed in our electoral process, different governments at the time when they have sensed that, of course, we are going out They don't have any message for the electorate. What they resort to think, just like the Patriotic Front thought, was that if they could have a lot of money, they would definitely buy their way out. However, I think to some extent the electorate in Zambia were able to redeem themselves. It was an issue whereby electorates, of course, could accept these monies, but at the time of voting, a political decision was made for them to be able to redeem themselves. So, of course, I want to agree that money actually has influenced the outcome of elections from different electoral levels. It could be judicial, it could be at parliamentary, it could be at parliament, and so forth and so on. And of course, the appeal is that we need to have possibly a legislation as far as political party and campaign financing is concerned to be able to contain this so that we are able to know where political parties get the funds that they want to pump in elections. I submit for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chimuka. I want now to bring Council Edgar Tabaro. You've just heard Mr. Chimuka discuss about some of the things that's posed by a threat of too much money in politics. That he has discussed about state captivity and policy capture. And in some African countries, we have dominant political parties that have been in power for some good long time, and it's very difficult for you sometimes to differentiate them from the state. And many opposition political parties often complain about how some of these political parties use state finances to finance their own election activities and campaigns. You, as one of the geopolitics experts in, I can say maybe Africa, what do you think needs to be done so that we can be able maybe to reduce on this kind of abuse of state resources by some of the dominant political parties that have stayed in power for so
long? You've raised a very pertinent question for the democratization process in sub-Saharan Africa. In Kenya, we had first a de facto one-party state from around 1969 to maybe 1982. And we had an attempted coup on 2nd of August 1982, after which President Moi, the Moi regime, enacted a du jour, a one-party state by amending, I think it was Article 2A or introducing Article 2A of the Constitution and making it a constitutional one-party state. We had that set in motion what they call in Kenyan parlance the second liberation of Kenya, more precisely, so-called the struggle for multipartyism, culminating in the elections of 1992, the first multi-party elections of 1992. They had had an early election in 1988, one of the most chaotic elections that has happened in this region. They lined up for their candidates. Remember, we also did the same thing in 1989, but theirs was much, much more chaotic. And for lack of a better word, it was a sham election. 1992 in Kenya, that's when monies were first poured in their politics openly. That's the first time Kenya, that's the time when the 500 bob currency note was introduced in Kenya. I remember Ruto and his running mate, Rigathi, were some of the protagonists in deepening that that monetization of Kenyan politics, and also violence, by the way. There was also another guy called Cyrus Jirongo, and the 500 bob was nicknamed the Jirongo note. Now, it had the effect of introducing runaway inflation. So runaway inflation, meaning monies in excess of, in circulation in excess of the goods and services that are being produced. The same situation we are having at present. But the aspect I wanted to bring, particularly after the Zambian aspect, the Zambian processes have been brought to our attention, and the dominance of certain political parties. Now, the clamor for multi-party democracy in Africa gained currency in 1990, and across Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, the then Zaire, Congo Republic, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, a bit of Tanzania, Sudan, Khartoum, Ghana, and surprisingly, Uganda was not among those countries. There was a clamor for democracy. There were pro-democracy demonstrations demanding for return of multi-party democracy in Africa. Now, how the countries churned out, or how the democratic processes turned out, also has a background in their political economy. Now, countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Angola, Zimbabwe, the political parties that emerged to be dominant, I would even add Tanzania, were those ones that have a background in the so-called revolutionary struggle. The revolutionary struggle. So the revolutionary parties that were basically, for lack of better language, really, and I beg your indulgences in this, they were founded on political violence. And those entities that were founded on political violence became political parties to participate in basically civil processes. Now, if you go and look at how all of those countries I've mentioned, how their multi-party democracy has turned out, it's basically entities that are deepened, entities that are grounded in political violence, participating in a civil space. So they've turned out to be very dominant, and their politics has become increasingly militant, that they stifle the civic, the civil, other civil, civic, whatever political parties that have emerged. I would even say the same thing for Tanzania. Under Kikwete, you remember the Minister for Home Affairs going on the floor of Parliament and saying, mukifanya fujo, lazima mutapigwa, and he was demonstrating how they'll beat their opponents. I'm singling out Tanzania because Tanzania is the better performing of all those entities I'm mentioning: Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Zaire, Angola. And the Zimbabwe situation is very well known. Now, Zambia, Malawi, Ghana, Kenya, surprisingly even Nigeria now, Mali to an extent tried but fell back into confusion and military coups. Benin, Senegal. Now, these countries have had the distinguished advantage over the others that we have had transfer, one, to an extent, we have had elections where the incumbents are not on the ballot paper. I don't know whether we're together. It's a very critical point to note that we have had elections in those countries where the incumbent is not on the ballot paper. Believe me, that may be a small step, but a giant move in terms of deepening democracy. Two, all those countries have had a shift of power from a ruling party to the opposition. Mind you, in Kenya, what is the ruling party and opposition may be blood now. I mean, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, Rigathi, Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, Wakina Ruto, and for some period, Raila were all in the same party. They were the ruling party. But soon after that, I think Raila abandoned ship with Kibaki Tosha. Then I think returned in 2007, and all of them somehow were in the same. Kenya has a very interesting, it's an interesting case study. But so the point I'm making is that the way political party or multi-party democracy has been churned out in this region is largely based on the processes that informed the politics in the country post 1990. Congo, you know, you remember the entity that took to a political struggle throughout Mobutu. In Burundi, we had an attempt at multi-party democracy which failed miserably with a genocide in 1993. Then a factionalized government that followed that couldn't hold water. Then a coup d'etat. Then 2005, you have CNDD, FDD, which is basically a military unit becoming a whatever political party and has dominated politics since 2005. In Tanzania, TANU, which became later Chama cha Mapinduzi. You know that. So in Malawi, Zambia, it's been markedly different because of those aspects. One, an incumbent not being on the ballot paper. Two, that they've transferred the power from a ruling party to the opposition, and later also reverting that dynamic. And lastly, the civic competence of these jurisdictions. If you look at where democracy is more deepened in this region, it's more pronounced where we have higher civic competence. Democracy, rule of law, which is an intrinsic aspect of democracy, is deepened in jurisdictions where they have higher civic competence. And when I'm talking of civic competence, I'm not talking of just community-based organizations. I'm talking of a country's intelligentsia. And when I mention intelligentsia in Ugandan parlance, we wrongly refer to them as elite. Elite is really, it's a very confusing term because elite means people in charge. But when you talk of the intelligentsia, you're talking of professional bodies, you're talking of industrialists, you're talking of businessmen, you're talking of trade unionists, you're talking of community-based organizations, you're talking of commodity chain associations. So when you go to Kenya, the intelligentsia was very critical, and up to the present, they are very critical in deepening their democracy. So in Kenya, you'll find industrialists like Ken Matiba, businessmen like Martin Shikuku, mentioned many names. Martin Shikuku, Paul Mwite was Secretary General of Safina Party, President of the Law Society of Kenya, very wealthy fellow. You had the President of Safina Party, Richard Leakey, a very well-established and renowned conservationist, archaeologist. Now, you had that caliber of people being at the forefront of clamor for deepening of democracy. The same situation will be seen in Malawi. Bakili Muluzi, who basically dethroned what they used to call the Ngwazi, late Kamuzu Banda, was a trade unionist in the postal union. You go to Zambia, same thing. Who was it? Frederick Chiruba. I mean, the present president of Zambia is a businessman. He's a businessman. Now compare those jurisdictions. But even Nigeria, by the way, the democracy we have there, the likes of Abiola, Moshood Abiola, late Chief Ernest Shonekan. Shonekan was the biggest retail trade and distributor. He had the franchise for Pepsi Cola in Nigeria. Buhari might have been a general, but he had retired into business. So you find businessmen called intelligentsia. What we
I think Tabaro's network is not.
Abel, you are muted. You are muted, Abel.
The difference between, it was giving us a difference between some countries that attain their democracy through ways that are really progressive, and those ones that had came through revolutionary movements and turned into political parties. So I wanted to bring Dr. Kazibu here now. You've just heard Mr. Edgar Tabaro try to give us a background on how some of the processes we went through in terms of growing up political parties. Like, for example, countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Angola, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Congo Zaire. He's talking about revolutionaries who went to the bush and fought, turned their revolutionary ideas into political parties, and ended up now turning things which, instead of running the country civilly, they are running it in a militant way. And we are seeing most of these countries which had revolutionaries turn into political parties, or revolutionary movements turn to political parties, are now encroaching on some of the state resources to keep themselves in power. So I wanted to know from you, how can we be able to delink some of these parties from encroaching on state resources to keep hold of power, so that they can also be able to make sure that there is competition and other people from opposition are given space to compete with them meaningfully. I'm muted, Dr. Kazibwe.
Oh, sorry, I had forgotten that I had muted. I was saying that I agree entirely with the Council Tabaro that there is a very big problem in many African states where the so-called revolutionary groups metamorphosed into political parties. And we expected those groups with a violent background to herald democracies in their respective states. I think we expected too much from them, and he has given quite a number of examples of places where these political parties have failed and have continued to be violent until today. But the question you addressed to me was, how do we get out of this? I think, again, one of the points has been raised by Edgar, that there is need for the intelligentsia, which he has explained pretty well. Many people tend to confuse it when we use the term elites. But the intelligentsia in majority of these countries has played a very critical role. Look at Nigeria and the two leading contenders today, Bola Tinubu and Alhaji Abubakar Atiku, typical intelligentsia. So they've got a stake in their country, and they have risked everything to ensure that they have a democratic state. Now, in many of these other states, including Uganda, people in that category do not want to participate in the politics. We trying to behave like the proverbial goose which swore never to step in the water till it learns how to swim. And you wonder how it would ever learn how to swim without stepping in the water. So for them, they're on the side saying the politics is bastardized. We are waiting for that moment when we can see sober people. People are not going to mudsling others. That's when we will join. When will that time ever come? We need to see the Kenneth Matibas. I mean, he lost his all, but for the good of Kenya, who was a stinkingly rich man, who would probably have chosen to be on the sidelines and live comfortably. In fact, the last time he even contested in 1992, he was crippled. That's why he couldn't even append his signature on his petition. And the court struck it out using that technicality when he sued, challenging the election of Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi in 1992. But many others, including people like Paul Mwite and many others. So I think some of the countries that are still lagging behind on the African continent, it's because the people in the intelligentsia have decided to stay on the sidelines. Then two, the issue of civic competence is also going to be important. But at the end of the day, I must say, there is some ray of hope. There is some ray of hope when we see what's happening, I mean, in Kenya. Despite the many things we have talked about Kenya in the last 1.5 hours, you still believe that it's a way ahead of many African states because of the sacrifices of men and women. People like Wangari Maathai. I mean, she would have afforded a better life outside Kenya. Kenneth Matiba and the others. I mean, even Charity Njiru, Martha Karua, and the others. Now, when you look at countries like Uganda, where do you see people in that league actively taking part in the border politics? I mean, it's a very huge challenge. It's a very huge challenge. I don't know what we can do to encourage such people to join. I mean, just imagine this election. The former CEO of Kerochi Industries in Kenya quitting her job to say, I'm going to stand as a senator of Nakuru. We need to see people like Henry Maguzi, Abel, and others saying we are leaving our comfort zones. Let's go for those small posts. Let me give you another example. In Kenya, besides the MP seats, you're having people with doctorates standing to become ward representatives. In some of those councils, you now have people with PhDs. You have people with masters. So I think in majority of these countries that are still lagging behind in terms of deepening democracy, it's because the intelligentsia has decided to be indifferent, and they are waiting for that time when everything has settled, when there is an easy come. And I don't think that time will ever come when we are just watching indifferently. But my point is that despite the challenges, we can see some ray of hope in countries like Kenya. We can see some ray of hope in countries like Zambia. Our colleague here has explained pretty well that despite the fact that the incumbent government of PF had all the resources of the state, the population chose to say no. And mark you, that was not the very first time. In the early 90s, that's how Chiluba came to power. That's how he came to power. That's how he was able to defeat the late Kenneth Kaunda. So lastly, the other important point is that we also need to appreciate that in majority of these countries where you see serious transformation in terms of democracy, it's true you're not seeing incumbents on the ballot papers. The moment incumbents choose to stay in power until when their maker calls them, you're going to have violent elections in every cycle, because for them it's a do or die. Probably if Moi in Kenya had chosen to stand in 2002, he would have died president of Kenya. And I'll end with this story, which has been told several times by William Ruto, that at one point they were seated in the State House of Kenya as results were coming out of the presidential elections in 2002. Some ministers started leaving one by one, but because the results were not in their favor, it was in the open that the results were not in their favor. Now ministers were leaving. The few that had stayed along, that had stayed in the room for some time, one of them went to Ruto because Ruto had worked in the office of the president and he was thought to be close to Moi. So a colleague in the cabinet asks him, is Muzei, and was referring to Moi, watching the very same TV station we are also watching? In other words, he couldn't believe that Moi was going to let things go the way they were going. But of course, for Moi, it wasn't a do or die. He was not the one on the ballot paper. But in 1992, because he was on the ballot paper, the election was too violent. It was too violent because it was a do or die. In 2002, 10 years later, because he was not on the ballot paper, he let the election swing in all directions, even in the case where it was not in his favor. So I think it is important that we find a way of convincing leaders that have overstayed in power on the African continent to have a graceful exit, the way Moi exited the stage. Despite the many atrocities he committed in Kenya, Kenyans forgave him. That's why, even at his funeral, the funeral was much more dignified than the one of Mwai Kibaki. But who of the two committed more crimes in Kenya? Who of the two had a more substantial effect in terms of development? It was certainly Kibaki. But why was Moi given a dignified send-off? Because you see, even if you develop a nation without giving it an opportunity to hand over power peacefully, all the other successes can be reversed in just 1 week. And there are many examples. We see Somalia, we see Libya, we see Ivory Coast, and many other states. So I think it's a very important point for us to address ourselves to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kazibu. Our time is fast spent, but I'm going to extend by like 15 minutes so that we can be able to conclude. I want now to bring Henry. You've just listened to Dr. Kazibu and also Council Edgar Tabaro discussing about how different our different political parties are formed in various countries of ours. And we have seen, for example, our own country, Uganda here, we have had one political party for almost the last 35 years. And there's always the same person in the ballot paper. And there's no way you can differentiate sometimes NRM from the state Uganda. And each time opposition keeps complaining, these people keep on using state resources for campaigns. I want you to try and compare the abuse of state resources in Uganda and what you saw in Kenya, because Kenya never had an incumbent on the ballot paper. But of course, there are allegations that there were also abuses of state resources in the campaigns of Kenya. How do you compare the two countries in terms of the large-scale abuse of state resources?
Of course, Abel Ndugu Tabaro hit the nail on its head earlier on when he compared the political parties and the kind of democracies we have in the two categories of sub-Saharan Africa, where you have situations where the political parties, the ruling parties, we went into opposition, and situations where you have political parties, you have revolutionary movements that came, transformed themselves into political parties. Now, I think if you look at the cases of Uganda, Rwanda, and others in that fold, I think it's contingent on the leaders that are occupying office to understand that the future of their countries depends on them, and that the earlier they gracefully retire, the better. But I also went back and picked it up from where our ancestors left it. The point on what is Africa's political thought. I think we need to pick up African political thought for the countries that have not yet reached there. Countries like Uganda, Rwanda, which have not reached there, we still have revolutionary movements that transmitted themselves into political parties in office. I think we shall get there. But that said, what is our political thought? Do we share the same political thought as Africa? And what kind of Africa do we want to see? And what is the role going to be of the different categories of the intelligentsia as you put them in Lukutabaro? So I think that's what. So in cases where this party that went to fight, and the fighters they used were not being paid, and they only got to pay them when they got to power, and their ability to pay them was because they captured the state and all its apparatus and made themselves into the state, in which case, therefore, you cannot tell the distinction between what is the state and what is the party. Then, of course, you see more abuses there. But I think what I saw in Kenya as well, there is a sense in which the incumbents again moved in, swung into action, because I cited on another platform a situation where outgoing President Uhuru Kenyatta carries a bailout. I think it was of 40 million Kenya shillings. I think he took it to Nzoia Sugar Company, and that money, that bailout was to pay for the sugarcane outgrowers. And the reason they were being that is being done because then there was that was a big voting population. And so to use government, and of course, as he was delivering the dummy check, he accompanied it with the message that remember Muzei and vote for Baba. So that was a misuse of a government resource for partisan political gains. Now, I understood as well that all through the campaign period, and even prior, because he started campaigning early, Nduguruto would host the coordination meetings in his current home, which is a state resource. And therefore, there was abuse and misuse of state resources across the political divide. So but it was nothing compared to situations to countries where the ruling party is fused with the state, and therefore when the state, the central bank is broke, the party is also broke. When the central bank gets money, the party gets money. So that license to raid the state coffers when they want, how they want, anytime, I think is the difference. But yes, state resource using state resources for partisan politics is one of the cancers that we have to address as Africans. I submit.
Thank you, Henry. I now want to bring Mr. Derek. What can you say before we end the show as you're parting short? Mr. Derek, are you on? Derek, can you hear me?
Yes, I
think Derek. Can you hear me?
Hear you.
Okay, Derek, yes, I can hear you now. I was asking you to give your parting shots because we are we have run out of time, but I've pushed the show for another 10 minutes. Okay, as Derek is trying to connect, I can go to Dr. Sam Kazibwe. Your concluding remarks, and as we head towards the end.
Thank you so much. I believe we still have quite a number of challenges in many African countries when it comes to the democratization process. But I also believe that there are several success stories. It's important that we draw from the examples of those success stories to better ourselves. As we speak today, we do not have to look to Asia. We do not have to look to the West. The solutions are not far away. Many of them are closer to us. If you're living in Uganda, there are one or two things you can borrow from Kenya, despite their challenges. And I think those can form a basis for our prosperity. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I now want to go back to Derek. Derek, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I believe you wanted me to give my parting shot. 3 things. Number 1 is I have listened to the conversation on the intelligence and the elite.
Your network is not, your network is still poor. I cannot get you clearly. I think we shall get back to you later. I want now to go to Council Edgar Tabaro.
I promise you it's not always this way. Yeah, today is just one of those days. And I think I sent you a text. So I was saying that we need to make our politics local, both in the voters and the voted. And that will be a very great indicator of the reforms on campaign financing and even just the political analysis of it. In these elections, we had an interesting case of one politician who was elected into office. She didn't have any money. I think she's 24 years old, and she campaigned using a border that was lent to her, and actually the rider was the one paying for the fuel. Until later on, she was able to. Someone donated a Pro Box, a small. I don't know if you have Pro Box in your country, but donated it to her. Only the services, not necessarily the vehicle. And she used it to campaign, and she was able to get elected into office. Obviously, during her campaign, there was never the question of money being a determinant to those who voted for her, but they listened to her because of her policies. Next time she gets back into office, she will have money. But I hope that the rest will still be about issues and personality and not.
Turn to Council Edgar Tabaro. Your last remarks?
I hope you can hear me. Am I loud and clear? Okay, now there are many lessons to pick from the electoral process. The electoral process and the election, the eventual date of election, and the process of post-election in the Republic of Kenya. On this occasion, our discussion has been limited to monetization of the politics and what lessons we pick. But in the broader perspective of things, what we desire is deepened democracy, deepened rule of law. Now, these twin processes of respect on developing the culture of respect of the law and democratization do not fall from the sky. We have to be intentional, we have to be deliberate, and we have to be purposeful. And in the way we approach things and drive a narrative, drive a discourse towards achieving them. They are not an event, they are a process. Now, those processes can only be as vibrant and as strong as the systems put in place, the systems developed for checks and balances. Now, those checks and balances are what enable us to hold public officials to account. When public officials are not held to account, when public officials are not called to account, and they can get away with each and everything, a culture of impunity takes effect, a culture of impunity sprouts. Now, controlling political party funding is part of the processes of holding public officials to account. However, we have to have it in our minds that the political party underpinnings in a republic like Uganda, very different from what has turned out in Kenya, very different from what has turned out in Zambia, only because of our political history. So it's incumbent upon persons like yourselves and myself to call the officials to account, but also set the agenda for these narratives. These things are not going to fall from the sky. The ball is right in our courts. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Council Edgar. Lastly, I will want to hear from Henry, and then we conclude the show.
Thank you very much, Abel. I think it's incumbent on us as citizens as well to push for more transparency, openness, but also accountability in the manner in which they not only manage funds, but in the manner in which decisions are taken. I think that is one thing that is lacking, because you cannot have democracy when there are no checks and balances, and it's us, the citizens, that are supposed to provide that checks and balances. In the case of Uganda, where political parties are inherently weak, opposition political parties, then it should be the citizens to step forward and assume that role. I thank you.
Thank you so much, all our guest panelists of the day today. It has come to one end of this monthly webinar series. I also want to thank our viewers and listeners outside there. This webinar series was brought to you by Alliance Finance Monitoring and the African Election Observers Network, AFIONET. The next edition of the Money in Politics webinar series will be on the last Thursday of next month. So let's get tuned, let's keep in touch. We shall roll out another edition and we shall have different guests hosted and we shall have a very fruitful discussion. I want to thank all of you outside there. But don't forget to subscribe to all our social media platforms on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and also TikTok.
Kenya has just gone through what is arguably the most monetized and commercialized general elections in the region. On ground, over 150 helicopters were observed being used by candidates at presidential, senatorial, and gubernatorial level. High-end SUVs were also observed being used by majority of the candidates. On one rally, the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya presidential candidate arrived at a rally with a convoy of 7 helicopters, of which 4 were privately owned. It was established that renting a chopper or helicopter was going for $2,000 per hour. There are suspicions that most of the money that was flowing in the election campaigns was coming from dirty sources, including syndicated corruption and money laundering. Kenya in 2013 developed a progressive election campaign financing law, but this law has twice been rendered futile by the same parliament that passed it. It is clear that none of the political elite in Kenya would wish to have this law enforced on them, hence the conspiracy to fight it. In the judgment made by court in May 2022, whereas court found that Parliament does not have powers to approve or disapprove the spending limits, it refused to quash the decision of the National Assembly to annul the enforcement of campaign financing regulations developed and published by the IEBC in 2021. It is against this backdrop that the Alliance for Finance Monitoring, ACFIM, in partnership with African Election Observers Network, AFIONET, have organized this webinar to interrogate the scale and magnitude of monetization of elections in Kenya and the lessons African electoral jurisdictions can draw from this.